Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to Brush Up on Budgeting. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. We're just going to wait for a few people to sign on. It's just starting at the top of the hour, so we'll wait for 1 or 2 more minutes and we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar called Brush Up on Budgeting. Let me just check my questions block to make sure that my audio is working. It doesn't seem to be having any issues. So if there are any questions during this webinar, or if my audio or something goes off, just go ahead and type in that questions box that's on your screen, and I'll be checking throughout this webinar and trying to make sure that I'm staying on top of those. All right. Well, as a few of you are continuing to sign on, welcome again to today's webinar on budgeting. My name is Sonia. I'm a curriculum developer here at NGPF, and this is the third Brush Up on webinar in the series that we're hosting, and I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about budgeting. In today's webinar, we're going to briefly talk about why we decided to have this series of webinars. For those of you who have attended either one or both of the previous webinars in this series, it'll be a little bit of a repeat, but very brief. And then we're really just going to dive straight into the content for budgeting. We'll cover things like how to make a budget, very popular budgeting rules like the 50-20-30 rule, needs versus wants, and more. And then we'll obviously conclude the webinar with a few finishing thoughts. Just wanted to point out that I am going to be covering really the main points in budgeting overall. This is not meant to encompass every single thing. So just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a heads up on that. The unit is quite extensive, and there's a lot that you can really talk about about budgeting. So just wanted to point that out. All right. So I do notice a few people are continuing to sign on. So let me actually, I guess we can get started, no problem. Before we get started with the content, I would actually love to learn a little bit more about you guys. So I'm going to launch 2 separate polls. And the first question here is, when in your personal finance course do you teach budgeting? So take about 20 to 30 seconds to answer this question. I would love to find out. Take about 10 more seconds. All right, thank you guys so much for voting. I'm going to close the poll and share it. I'm also going to open up my questions tab just to see if anyone put any extra comments in there. Okay, perfect. So it looks like a good number of you teach budgeting at the very beginning of your course to lay a foundation. More than half of you teach it in the middle once you've covered a few other units. And then just a few of you put teach budgeting at the end as a way to tie all the other units together. And of course, there are a handful of you guys who put other. Awesome. If you put other, I would love to hear what you guys do for when you teach budgeting. We're always curious to know how teachers are actually ordering their units, just so that we can see the variety and how different teachers teach different units. So thank you. I have one more question for you, and this is, what is your biggest challenge in teaching budgeting? Take another 20 seconds for this one. Take about 5 more seconds. Maybe another 5 more seconds. I just see a few people have yet to vote. And I'm going to close the poll. Okay, so it looks like well over a majority of you guys gets the biggest challenge is getting students to make realistic estimates for costs. Absolutely, I've totally encountered this in the classroom myself. And then a number of you have trouble staying up to date with the latest apps and trends. Completely understand that. It feels like there are new apps kind of popping up every day, and we will be talking a little bit about some of them that are up. Identifying ways students can stick to a budget, perfect, and helping students differentiate between needs and wants. Awesome. So that one doesn't seem to be too much of a problem for the majority of you guys. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to hide those results now. Perfect. So thank you guys for answering those 2 questions. It does give me a little bit better understanding of, what is your experience like teaching budgeting? How do you guys teach it and when? And also, what do you find most challenging? So thank you for that. Just a quick overview of why we decided to have this series in the first place. We started this Brush Up on Content webinar series just a few months ago. We kicked it off with, I believe, financial pitfalls, and we did paying for college, I think last month. And both of those were really successful, and we really attribute that to the fact that these were really teacher-requested webinars. In a lot of our conversations with teachers, we found that a lot of teachers just wanted to brush up on their content knowledge, especially after the summer. And as you guys are gearing up with your new year, it's really nice to be able to kind of refresh on your content. Even if it may or may not be new, it's just nice to get a refresher. And so what we've really tried to do in these webinars is we try to align the content with what we cover in the unit. Sometimes the webinar will follow the flow of the unit itself, and sometimes it won't. So for example, this webinar is going to follow a slightly different flow in terms of the lessons. So if you go on the NGPF site, you go to the budgeting unit page, you'll notice that the flow of the lessons that I'm going to talk about is just going to be a little bit different, just because I felt like it flowed better for the purpose of a webinar. So don't be alarmed if you notice that. And I did also find a few different resources, but the majority of the resources in this webinar are in our lessons. So just wanted to point that out to you guys. All right, so let's get started. I'm just going to again check my questions. Okay, so let me backtrack here a little bit. I did get some answers from teachers who, I think you guys are providing the other option for the first poll that I asked, which was, when do you teach budgeting? And also, what challenges do you guys have when teaching budgeting? So one person said, I introduce budgeting when the H&R Block budget challenge begins, and their simulation this fall starts tonight at midnight. Nice. Well, congratulations and good luck with the H&R Block budget challenge. I know a lot of teachers use that one. Thank you for providing that. And one other challenge I believe that someone mentioned was that students get a lot of money from their parents. Yes, that is definitely one challenge that I have seen in some high schools where, students kind of get money from their parents on a weekly basis, and they're kind of used to that. And so how do you develop a realistic budget when you're suddenly on your own? Maybe you're in college, or how do you even envision a budget for when you're an adult, which is for a high schooler years down the road? So that is definitely a challenge. Thank you. All right, without further ado, let's get started with content. And as I'm going through this webinar, please do enter in any questions that you have in the questions box. I'll do my best to kind of pause throughout the webinar and check that questions box to make sure that I'm addressing them. If you guys have questions that I'm not really sure what the answer is, I will take some time after the webinar to do a little research and get back to you. So I'll email you directly. All right, so let's talk content. I really want to kick off with talking about some basic budgeting topics. So when I was teaching in the classroom, I was specifically teaching some high school seniors how to create a college budget. And before I really started diving into, this is how you create a budget, here's what goes into it, I really wanted to make sure that they bought into the idea of, hey, a budget is really important. And so I spent about 10 minutes just kind of having a conversation with them on why should you even have a budget in the first place. And, I kind of kicked this off as an open-ended question, but as a class, we really came to this conclusion that a budget is a really good, effective money management tool. It allows you to see where your money is coming in from and where it's going out. And what I think is really important too is that it can help you achieve your financial goals. And it really helps you understand your personal money habits and your relationship to money. So I kind of see this first bullet point as a very literal use of a budget, whereas these second and third bullets are really more broad and kind of open ways to use your budget. And I think students oftentimes don't think of their budget as a way for them to examine their relationship with money. And I think once you introduce that concept, at least when I was in the class, a lot of students were like, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't really think about that. So I would really encourage students, and when you guys are teaching budgeting in the class, I'm sure you do this already, but really encouraging students to think about what are their financial goals and how do those goals reflect their values and what's important to them. And it really helps take the budget or the concept of having a budget from a day-to-day or month-to-month kind of, okay, let me just update my spreadsheet kind of tool to this much broader money management skill and tool that they can really continue to use for their lives. And I think that's really where students can kind of understand and get that buy-in. So throughout this webinar, I've tried to embed some of our data crunches and questions of the day to make it a little bit more interactive. So here's a question for you guys. What % of Americans spend more than they earn? And I'm going to launch this as a poll and give you guys about 20 seconds to answer. So go ahead. And some of you may have already done this question of the day or data crunch in your classroom, so you may already know the answer. All right, so take about 5 more seconds. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll. Okay, let's see here. So none of you thought that it was 7%, which is correct. 12% thought, sorry, 8% of you thought that 12% of Americans spend more than they earn, then 36, and then 54. So the correct answer here is option D. 54% of Americans spend more than they earn. And, about 50% of you guys actually knew that. So that's great. I remember, being quite shocked when I heard this statistic, because it really then helped me even better prepare myself to tell students, like, hey, this is why having a budget is important. Having a budget can help you prevent yourself from overspending. So that's just another great question to ask students to help them kind of buy into the concept. And then here's another one for you that I want you to answer. How did teen spending change from 2003 to 2014? Take another 15 to 20 seconds. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, gonna close the poll. And looks like a lot of you are very in tune with teenagers today. Teens do spend more on food today. I'll show you guys a graph in actually just a second. So this is a graph that is from, I believe, one of our data crunches that you can find on our website. So you can see here that teens from 2003 to 2014 have really increased their spending on food, primarily being kind of the largest one. Accessories and personal care has increased a little bit. Shoes has increased, electronics, video games, but music and movies has gone down, as well as clothing, events, books, magazines, furniture, kind of around the same-ish. Awesome. So those that was just kind of like a brief kickoff for me. The main thing to really establish with students is, why even use a budget? Why is it even important? How can this become a lifelong tool or skill that I use to develop a good relationship with money, and for me to achieve my financial goals, rather than just thinking about it as a way to track money, where it comes in and how it goes out. The next part of this webinar is really about, well, how do you actually create a budget? Well, and again, a lot of this information is not going to be new for you, but really meant to be a refresher on what are some things to kind of present in the classroom. So when students, if they're not very familiar with how to create a budget, they might think that, hey, if I have a summer job, or maybe it's my first job, what I expect to get paid is actually going to be my gross pay, which is what I'm paid before taxes have been taken out of my paycheck. Obviously, this is incorrect. They actually want to use their net pay, which is what they're paid after taxes have been taken out of their paycheck. And if they don't understand the difference between these two, their budget is going to, as a result, be very unrealistic, and they're going to have a lot more money than they think allocated towards different pieces of their budget. So I would say this is probably number one. Remember to use your net pay when creating your budget. Then for me, when I was teaching this to students, a lot of students are saying, okay, great, I understand that, but what do you actually put into a budget? Like, what goes into it? And so, I really tried to simplify it. So just stressing to students that a budget is really all about two things. It's about your income, or how much money is coming in, aka your net pay, and then your expenses. What are you spending money on? And again, this webinar is taking the perspective of an adult budget. So, if you're a college student or a high school student, the expenses part might be a little bit different. But as an adult, your expenses are going to be things like rent, utilities, food, transportation, bills. Don't forget those student loan bills, entertainment, activities, and more. So, just trying to get students to understand, like, okay, maybe it's a little bit, what are some of the categories that you can include? Now, this is one of my favorite data crunches that we have in our curriculum. What does the average household spend money on? And it just really, I think, is a great way to introduce students, again, to what kinds of categories do adults spend money on. You can see from here, housing, transportation, food, etc., etc. So this is a great data crunch. I've linked it here so that at the end of this webinar, you will receive these slides. I've linked this image straight to the data crunch that I got this image from. And so for me, I really think that this is a great way to kind of kick off the budgeting unit, because it really allows students to see what are the different categories that adults spend money on in their budget. And also, how do different people budget their money? There's no one way or the other. There's no right way or wrong way. I think it's important to stress to students that there are multiple ways that you can budget, and it really just depends on what works for you. So here are a few that you guys have probably already heard of. The first one is the 50-30-20 rule. I've also seen this as the 50-20-30 rule, but the numbers still correspond with the same things, but you just might see those two the middle and last numbers flipped. So this is probably one of the most famous budgeting rules, if you haven't heard of it already. It's really meant for beginning budgeters who are just, think of your average college graduate who's like, oh my gosh, I don't really know what to do with my money right now. And this is just a great concept to introduce to them. So 50% of your money would go towards your needs. So like groceries, housing, car payments, insurance, etc. 30% would go to your wants. So shopping, eating out, hobbies, etc. And finally, 20% goes towards your savings. The one thing I want to point out here is that, I've read a few different pieces about this rule, and it's a little interesting because the 20% not only includes your savings, but also any debt repayment that you have. So when I think of a college graduate who, I think the average college student loan debt right now is about $35,000, that is, you have to think about your monthly payment, and that's supposed to be in this 20%. So depending on what your monthly student loan payment is, you might be allocating more than 20% towards your savings and your debt payment. And so that might come out of your wants, it might come out of your needs. So that's just something to point out to students that, this isn't like exactly 50%, 30%, 20%. It might be 45 and 25 and, so on and so forth. You can kind of tweak it. But definitely this is just a good foundation or guideline to introduce people to budgeting. Another really popular budgeting strategy is called the envelope method. So this is where, as you can see from the image, you literally take envelopes and put however much money you've allocated towards that category and put that category name on that envelope. So for example, if you have food, you make a food envelope for the month, you put however much money that you've allocated towards food in that envelope, and then however much money you have in that envelope is how much you're going to spend on food. And sometimes this is a very effective budgeting strategy for a lot of people because it's very literal, it's very tangible, and so when they have literally run out of money from that envelope, they can't spend any more on that category. So for people who really like to deal with like the physical paper bills, this is a very effective strategy. You can also take this online or digitally by using the multi-bank account method. This I think is a little hard for high schoolers or even college students to implement. So again, remembering that this is more for like the adult budgeter. I just read a few articles where different people would actually use a different bank account for different categories of their budget. That's not to say that they had 10 different bank accounts, but they would use maybe one bank account for 2 or 3 categories and another one for two or three other categories. So they had like one debit card that they would use only on food, and so on and so forth. So I think those 3 budgeting strategies are really common between people, especially the 50-30-20 rule and the envelope strategy. I'm just going to pause here and see if there are any questions. Okay, looks like we're good. Perfect. So this webinar obviously would not be complete without mentioning all of the wonderful fintech apps that have been, kind of prevailing in the past decade or so, or even less than that. This great article from, I believe it's The Balance, talks about the 8 best budgeting apps to download in 2018. Again, this is linked in the webinar slides, so you'll get this. But what I really liked about this article is that it really broke down, it identified 8 different apps, but it also broke down what each one is best for. So Mint is probably the most popular and kind of well-known budgeting app out there right now. And it's, according to this article, they're saying that it's kind of the best overall budgeting apps. It really allows you to connect your bank account to the app, and it kind of tracks how you use your money. But what I really like is that the article also mentions like, hey, best to keep from overspending, use Pocket Guard. This one I thought was pretty funny. Best for type A personalities, you need a budget, or YNAB. Best for just budgeting, use Wally. So, and you can see here there's even a digital version of the envelope style, which is envelopes. So this is a great article to check out if you're introducing budgeting apps. And I think for teens, obviously using apps on their phone and stuff is a really effective way to manage their money and kind of securely do it as well. All right. And then, when you're creating a budget, it's always important to think about your income and what form that comes in. So, I think a lot of times we think about budgeting assuming that the person is going to be on an annual salary basis, but it's really important to consider what if you weren't paid on an annual salary basis? What if you were paid on wages? What if you worked a different number of hours per week and therefore as a result the money coming in fluctuated every week? So how would that impact your budget, and how would you kind of get a better handle on your money? So in those kind of situations, you really want to focus on those fixed costs, things like your rent, utilities, which fluctuate a little bit, but generally tend to kind of be around a certain ballpark figure. Things like your monthly health insurance or car payment, things like that. You really want to make sure that you're focusing on those and that you're making enough money to cover at least those costs. We have a great resource called Living Paycheck to Paycheck, which I've linked here. It's a great activity, and it really has students play this interactive game called Spent. Some of you have probably played this in your classroom. It basically has students go through one full month of monthly expenses, and they have to see if they can get through the entire month without getting to a negative balance. And throughout the game, they go through different scenarios that are kind of surprises that come up throughout the game. So for example, your mother had to have a hospital visit, pay $150, or do you think she has to pay it herself? Your car tire went flat, fix it on your own, or go and get like a professional to fix it. So things like that, where students actually have to make a choice, and they have to then see, what impact does that have on the leftover balance that they have to spend that month? What are the different kinds of life situations that kind of happen and we can't really predict. And what is the importance then of saving money and keeping an emergency fund? And it really brings to the forefront this issue of income fragility, of being able to budget your money if you're living paycheck to paycheck. What does that look like? So if you haven't already played that with your students before, it's a great way to kick off budgeting and really just the personal finance course in general. All right, let me again check my questions box before I move on to needs versus wants. I feel like I'm just talking a lot here, so I want to make sure I'm addressing anything that you guys are posting. All right, looks like we are good. So the next thing that I want to talk about is needs versus wants. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys talk about this in the poll that I launched at the very beginning of the webinar. A lot of you identified that this is not a challenge for your students. And I think, even when I've taught in the classroom, needs versus wants is a fairly simple concept for students to get, and they do really easily understand, like, okay, this isn't really a need, this is a want, or vice versa. Things that I would want to highlight about needs versus wants is that obviously they vary from person to person. Maybe that coffee in the morning is a need for someone and it's a want for another person. Something that I actually really like to highlight as well is how important is it to allocate money for fun, for things that bring you joy. When I was teaching the same group of high school students for college, I don't think I'll ever forget this. I had one college high school senior who basically put zero money for any kind of social activities, for any kind of eating out, anything that really would be more than the bare minimum. And, as a result, he had quite a bit of money left over each month. But when I asked the class as a whole, do you think that this is sustainable? Do you think that you would actually enjoy this kind of lifestyle? He really had to kind of question his own thinking, and he had to kind of go back and think, oh, actually, when I'm a freshman in college, I probably will want to hang out with friends. I probably will want to go out and eat dinner occasionally. That's not in the dining hall. So this concept of underspending in categories really is, I think, something that students don't think about. I think overspending is a concept that's really easy to understand, but this idea of, hey, how much does my happiness and joy, the things that bring me kind of the social interaction that I need, how much does that cost, and how important is that to me? And I think that's kind of an interesting conversation to have in regards to needs versus wants. Another kind of unique thing to talk about when it comes to needs versus wants is, all the subscriptions that we now have available to us. We have Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Spotify, etc., etc. And are these really needs or are they wants? And obviously, it's going to be different for any individual. And finally, where does charitable giving fit in? Again, for a high school or college student, this may not be the primary section of their budget, but as an adult, a lot of people do consider charitable giving sometimes to be a very necessary part of their budget, and other people might think, hey, if I have a few extra dollars, I'm more than willing to give it. So where does that fit in? Is that a need or is it a want? So just some things to highlight there. Another thing that I wanted to highlight that I thought was very interesting, and I apologize that the font on this particular slide is very small, but I just had a few quotes that I wanted to highlight for you guys here. This is a behavioral finance perspective on needs versus wants from Sarah Newcomb. She's a senior behavioral scientist at Morningstar, and she takes a very interesting perspective on needs versus wants that I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of to introduce to your students if you choose to. She basically says that, rather than trying to think of things as a need versus a want, let's instead kind of assume that everything is a need, and instead let's try to put our energies towards identifying what is the need that you're trying to satisfy. For example, and I'll highlight it here. She says, consider your afternoon latte run. What's the need that you're trying to meet with that latte? Is it alertness, or maybe it's the mental break from your work? Either way, a walk around the block could do the trick and keep $4 in your pocket. And I just thought this was really interesting because she says that rather than trying to differentiate between, oh, is my $4 latte a need or a want, she kind of says that if you're trying to take that mindset of, hey, if I don't need this for survival, then everything else is a want, then you're kind of neglecting your emotional needs. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective on it. And I think she really gets down, her main point is really understand what you're trying to satisfy. What exactly are you trying to achieve from that $4 coffee? And coincidentally enough, we revamped our financial pitfalls unit and released it today. And one of our new activities is called Change a Bad Financial Habit. And there's actually another, there's an American, I think he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist named Charles Duhigg. And he basically created this thing called the habit cycle. He says that the habit cycle has a cue, a routine, and a reward. Each habit, for example, if your routine is buying that $4 cup of coffee, that would be your routine. The cue might be a certain time of day, so maybe it's the afternoon and you're like, oh, it's time to get my $4 cup of coffee. And your reward might be alertness, it might be getting that mental break from work, etc., etc. And I just thought it was so interesting that I saw this direct connection between what Charles Duhigg says here and what Sarah Newcomb says here, that they're both really trying to argue that if you're really trying to identify between a need and a want, if you're trying to change a repetitive financial habit that is maybe draining your budget, then rather than just trying to change that habit or that specific behavior, you really need to first identify why you are participating in that behavior in the first place, because otherwise you're just going to find something else that satisfies that same need. So I hope I didn't get too confusing there, but I just wanted to kind of highlight both this activity and this other take on needs versus wants that I just thought was a little bit different than what we typically hear today. So again, let me pause here, check my question box. Okay, looks like we're still good. Awesome, I didn't lose you with the behavioral finance stuff, or rather bore you with it. So I will move on now. So once students have really identified their needs versus wants, we really get into this idea of cost of living. And, you know, we really created this lesson around cost of living, not just to include what is it like to rent an apartment, but really to kind of broaden that perspective and think about what is it like to live in different parts of the world and how does that impact your salary, how does that impact your budget. According to Investopedia, cost of living is the amount of money needed to sustain a certain level of living, including basic expenses such as housing, food, taxes, and healthcare. Cost of living is often used to compare how expensive it is to live in one city versus another locale. And so we didn't just want students to dive straight into, okay, how do you rent an apartment? We really want them to take a step back and think about, where do you want to live? How does that impact your spending? How is that going to impact how much you earn? And ultimately, how does that impact your budget? So to kind of keep going on this point, we have, I think this is a question of the day called, how does the cost of living vary by state? And in that question of the day, which I've linked here, you'll see that there's this really great graph that illustrates how the geographic location of where you live can impact how much you earn and what your purchasing power is. So this graph here shows us the relative value of $100 in each state in the US. And you can see that the darker colored states, the purchasing power is really high. So in states like Dakota, Arkansas, Mississippi, Atlanta, these darker colored states, $100 is really equivalent to like 115. Whereas states that are on the lighter side, New York, New Jersey, California, you're really getting into kind of a lot less money, almost $85. Hawaii over here. So this is a great introduction to the concept that, hey, where you live is going to impact how much you earn, how much you spend, how much you have to live, really. Once we kind of introduce students to that concept, I think then, you can really get to this idea of, okay, well then, depending on where you live, you can then go and find an apartment for yourself. We have a whole lesson on how to find an apartment, this whole activity. And so I'm not going to go into all of these individual things, but just things to consider when you are trying to find an apartment. Obviously, rent, how much is it? How much are utilities? Do you want to get renter's insurance? We have a lot of resources on renter's insurance as well. Do you want to live with roommates? How does that impact your budget? Are there any other amenities? And of course, location. If you decide to live within a city versus a suburb, what impact does that have? How close or far is that from your work? Lots of different factors to consider. And usually, as you guys I'm sure have found with students, sometimes they make some unrealistic choices, and it's kind of fun to ask them those kind of questions that challenge them and to think about these things a little bit more realistically. All right, let me again just pause here. Perfect, no questions. I'll just keep going. After thinking about the cost of living, naturally I think the next thing to think about is the cost of food. So here's another fun question of the day for you guys. Bacon, eggs, or bananas? Which breakfast food had the largest price increase over the last decade? Go ahead and answer the question. I'm going to launch this as a poll. Oopsie, wrong one. Go ahead and answer that one. Oops, sorry there, guys. I accidentally closed the poll instead of trying to unmute myself. I'm so sorry about that. But let me share the results with you guys. So the majority of you thought eggs rose the most in the last decade. The correct answer here is actually bacon, which was the lowest one here. So that is a little bit surprising. Let me show you guys a graph or chart. So you can see here that bacon actually rose 58% to $5.79, whereas bananas rose by 10%, and eggs actually declined by 15% over the past decade. So I think this is a question of the day. I don't know if I've provided the link for this one. I'll try to remember to link that. If I forget though, you can totally just search on the NGPF website for like bacon, eggs, bananas, and it'll come up. So again, just trying to introduce students to the concept of, hey, the cost for food can sometimes fluctuate, and you really want to think about these different things when you are incorporating it into your budget. So like your food budget is really obviously going to be groceries plus any food that you spend on eating out. And what are some ways that you can then save money? So obviously you can eat at home, you can use coupons. Unit price, I think, is one of the biggest, most effective strategies that students can use. If you're not sure what unit price is, basically it's the price per unit that the store is charging. So for example, if you go to the store and you're looking at 5 different brands of cereal, you want to look at their unit price. So maybe one box of cereal is like $5.99 for I don't know how much cereal boxes are, but I'm just going to say about 16 ounces or something. Another one could be $3.99 for the same amount. And so you want to think about, well, what would the unit price be? Maybe actually you have a third box that is $8.99 for 32 ounces. And so you might think that the $8.99 box is the most expensive, but it might actually be cheaper if you divide and find out how much it actually costs per ounce. So using unit price, you can actually help students save a lot of money. For both coupons and unit price, we have some really great videos. The coupon one, I'm going to warn you, is a fairly old video, but it's probably one of the favorites for the NGPF staff just because the woman who is featured in it is kind of a master couponer. She has this huge binder full of coupons that she kind of cross-references as she's going through the aisles of the supermarket, and she's able to find the most extraordinary deals. And so, sometimes when I show it in the classroom, I think students just kind of get a kick out of seeing this woman use such a intense strategy for saving so much money. I think her end receipt for about $74 worth of grocery ends up being somewhere in like less than $1 or just a few cents, just because she used all these coupons. And so I think students really enjoy that, so I link that here. We also have a great video on unit price and how to calculate it and how to read different price tags at different stores. And finally, I think it's really important to, again, stress to students that, hey, if you're going grocery shopping, be really wary of how they place their products on the shelves. It's a common known marketing technique that things that are placed in the eye level shelves are usually higher priced, whereas things that are on the lower price shelves, and I think the higher price shelves, are sometimes a little bit lower priced. So things like that, it's just fun to kind of point those things out to students because they're often not aware of these things. And of course, just like the rise of budgeting apps, there's been a huge influx in the number of food order and delivery apps that we now have today. When I just Googled food order and delivery apps, this was kind of the result that I had on Google, but I think there might even be more than this. I think some of the most popular ones are Grubhub, DoorDash, Uber Eats. Eat24 I've also heard of. But for me, I think the really interesting part of this conversation comes with, is this a need or a want? And really, you're really paying for convenience here. So how much are you willing to pay for that convenience? And how much does that matter to you? And I think, again, it varies per person. And I think it's just a very interesting conversation to have in the classroom because there's no right answer. It's very open-ended. Awesome. Let me again just do a quick pause here. No questions. Awesome. I have a question for you. Groceries or restaurants? Where do you think Americans are spending their money? Let me launch it as a poll and take 15 seconds to vote here. Take about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, so the majority of you think that Americans spend more money on restaurants than groceries. So let me show you a graph. And this is actually kind of a trick question. So both groceries and restaurants have actually increased, which I thought was very interesting. If I had been voting on this question, I also would have voted for restaurants. But you'll see here that from 1992 to 2015, people used to spend a lot more on groceries, a lot less on restaurants. But now, at least in 2015, they've really come to about the same amount, which really goes to show kind of the trends in spending in the United States on food and restaurants. All right. So we've talked a lot about, what goes into a budget, how to create a budget, the cost of living, needs versus wants. And after cost of living, we really talked about food and how to find an apartment, stuff like that. But there's also this other aspect of, well, what's the cost of transportation? So just like food and the cost of living, trying to find an apartment, et cetera, the cost of transportation is really going to depend on where you live. So here's another quick question of the day. I tried to just incorporate some of the ones that I thought were relevant to these different topics. This is the very last one. When is the best time to book a flight to get the cheapest fare? Take 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Okay, looks like you guys are right. So the best time to book a flight is 47 days in advance. Very, very specific. Let me show you a chart. So this chart shows you, based on 4.9 million trips analyzed during 2014, you can see here that 320 days out in advance, the price starts off around 413. The closer you get, it starts to dip, and then around 47 days is right here. It starts to increase, and then by the time you get to the 20-day mark, it just skyrockets. Like it's pretty crazy. So, just a fun little question of the day to ask your students to kind of get them into the idea of what is the cost of transportation. I know this question of the day is specifically about flights, but obviously on a day-to-day basis, we're trying to get students to think about how does the location of where you live affect your transportation options? Is there public transportation there? Do you need a car? Do you want a car? Do you prefer to drive? What are maybe the weather is a factor to consider? Maybe if there's like heavy snow where you live. Do you want to walk, et cetera, et cetera. I think another great question to ask is how long do you plan to live there? Which, I think a lot of students may not think about. I've definitely heard stories of people moving to a place where they end up only living for about 8 months, but they bought like a whole new car, et cetera, and then they ended up selling it because they moved to the opposite coast and didn't want to deal with, moving the car cross country, stories like that. So kind of thinking a little bit about the future can really save you some money down the road. Um, Regarding the car, we do have a full lesson on what are the different costs of car ownership. Of course, due to time, I'm not going to talk about all of them. But I do want to kind of post the question out there to ask students that how does your preferred mode of transportation affect your overall quality of life? I think that, being in California here in the Bay Area, if you guys have been here, you'll hear us talk a lot about the cost of living and the time that we spend on the roads because of the increase in traffic congestion. And so for us, I think quality of life has a big relationship with how we just get to and from different places on a day-to-day basis. And I think, as young students, they may not really consider that or take that into mind. Just a few thoughts here on the cost of car ownership, because I know it is a really big thing, especially with teenagers who might be getting their first car or buying a used car. From an adult perspective, it's important to think about the different options available to you. So what is it like to buy a new car versus leasing versus buying an old car? And then obviously, when you're thinking about what the different costs are and how they fit into your budget, you want to make sure that you're budgeting money not only to cover that initial payment if you're buying a used car, but to also really make sure that you're able to cover insurance, oil changes, other maintenance things, your annual license and registration fees, gas and parking. I think a lot of students don't quite see car ownership as encompassing all of these different costs that really add up and increase the overall cost of owning a car. And of course, the rise of rideshare apps has made budgeting for transportation a very interesting job, I think, in terms of managing your budget. I think more than ever before, we have so many different options of moving around to different places. So if you decide not to have a car and you're relying on these rideshare apps, maybe you live in a big metropolitan city like New York or San Francisco, where Lyft and Uber are actually really common. I think some things to consider there are that you might be saving on car costs, but you might also then be paying a lot on these rideshare apps. I have a lot of friends who are living in the city who don't own a car, but they easily spend at least $10 on average per ride, and that's just for like a short ride. So, just thinking about, these are convenient again, but how much are you willing to pay for that convenience? Similar to those food delivery apps as well. And finally, we want to then kind of, once students have established this budget, what goes into it, what are different categories that go into my budget, I really want them to kind of think about, well, how might my budget change in the future? And so some questions to kind of pose to them are, how will your budget change as your life circumstances change? If you decide to have a family, how will your budget change? Some other kind of minor points. How can inflation affect your purchasing power? And what does this mean for your income? And how can different spending trends impact your personal spending? So just a few things here to note. This is, I think, a graph from one of our data crunches. I'll enlarge it here so that you guys can see it a little bit more clearly. It illustrates the price changes from 1996 to 2016, so over a span of about 20 years. And it's really interesting because you see the overall increase or decrease for different goods and services. So you can see TVs, minus 96%, textbooks and college tuition around the 200% increase, which is really crazy. Childcare, medical care, food and beverages, housing, these things have all increased. New cars, household furnishings, clothing, a little plus or minus here and there. Wi-Fi, software, and toys, big decrease. So, just getting students to think about, okay, maybe I have my budget, a certain way right now, but how might that change in 10 to 20 years? I just want to highlight another resource from NGPF that kind of has to do with this. It's one of our number chugs, which primarily has students focus on practicing math skills in the context of personal finance. So this is a great number chug to do with your students if you want to introduce this concept of how does inflation impact my purchasing power over time. And finally, I really want to highlight this summative assignment, which is a salary-based budget. I think it is a wonderful resource to use in your classroom if you want students to really get a hands-on experience of creating an actual budget. So in this activity, students choose a career path that they're thinking, and they'll actually determine their take-home or net pay. Once they've actually put some money away for their savings and in their emergency funds, they actually then try their hand at creating and implementing an adult budget. Sorry, not implementing, just creating an adult budget. And then they actually have a chance to reflect on what the process was like for them, maybe, what surprised them. So I've linked that here, create a salary-based budget. If you would rather have students focus on something that's a little bit closer in terms of timeline, we have the same type of activity, but meant for when they go to college. So really the same outline, the same budget. Both activities have students use Google Sheets. So they'll actually build out a budget in a spreadsheet and get to practice some spreadsheet skills as well. All right. So I did a lot of talking today, and thank you for listening to me as I kind of went through. There was a lot to talk through. I'm sure I kind of stumbled here and there because there was a lot to cover. So thank you so much for attending. If you guys have any questions, I'm just going to pause here, see if there are any questions. Okay, looks like there aren't. I just want to highlight some upcoming webinars that we have coming up. So we have some great webinars that you can see here. We have the ins and outs of NGPF on Schoology. So if you use Schoology as your primary LMS platform, definitely sign up for that one. We also have an upcoming Brush Up On webinar on investing that's happening about a month from now in October. And then a month from then, we have one on careers and employment. And then finally, we have our annual What's Trending in Personal Finance webinar that's really popular. So I would definitely encourage you guys to go to our webinars page that's linked right here and sign up for all of the ones that you can. So hopefully that they're useful to you. After this webinar, I would really appreciate it if you could take our post-webinar survey, check out our budgeting unit, and if you go to our budgeting unit and you're like, whoa, these lessons are way too long, I don't have the time, check out our semester course for some condensed lessons that you can use in your classroom. All right, well, that is the end of the webinar. Thank you guys so much today for joining me. I really look forward to having you attend some future webinars. And thank you again. Have a great day.